Before we begin, I need to ask you something. Stories like this are not easy to tell, and they are even harder to hear. If you feel the weight of these forgotten voices, if you believe these hidden histories deserve to be uncovered, then subscribe to this channel. It costs nothing, but it keeps these buried truths from fading back into silence. Beneath the sweltering Alabama sun, there stands a shack that time itself seems to have abandoned. Its wooden frame leans like a body long broken, windows black with rot, and the surrounding trees choke it in shadow, as if even nature is ashamed of what once lived there. To most, it's just another ruin scattered across the South. But for those who know its story, this shack is not simply wood and nails. It is a tomb of flesh, blood, and secrets, a place where generations collapsed inward, folding in on themselves until the line between kin and stranger no longer existed. What you are about to hear is not folklore, it is not rumor, it is the record of one family whose name has been erased from polite conversation, whose faces have been erased from public memory. But their story, hidden inside that shack, still breathes beneath the boards, still whispers when the wind passes through the cracks. And if you listen closely, you'll understand why no one dares to linger near it after dark. The family who lived here were not poor in the way the world often imagines poverty. They were something else entirely. Sealed away from townsfolk, rarely seen in public, their isolation was complete. Children born to cousins, mothers who became sisters in the bloodline, fathers whose titles blurred between parent and grandfather. Each birth marked a deeper collapse of the family tree, branches curling back onto themselves until they no longer reached toward the sky. And while the town whispered, no one intervened, because in that part of Alabama, here are wounds you do not touch. There are houses you leave to rot on their own. Imagine walking into that shack in the late 1950s, the air thick with mildew, the floor sagging beneath your weight, the silence so absolute it feels like it's holding its breath. You'd see faces staring back at you that don't quite fit together, eyes set too close, jaws underdeveloped, teeth angled in ways that seem to resist nature itself. They weren't monsters, but they weren't free either. They were human beings caught in a cycle they didn't choose, yet couldn't escape. Every smile, every glance carried the mark of history's silence, and outside, the world went on pretending they didn't exist. This shack was not just a home, it was a cage disguised as shelter, a place where blood remembered itself too many times, until memory became deformity, and deformity became the family's only inheritance. And once you learn what happened inside, you will never see Alabama's quiet countryside the same way again. The deeper you trace the story of this family, the more suffocating it becomes. Generations were stacked upon one another, but instead of branching outward, the bloodline circled like a closed loop. In towns across the South, families like this became whispers at the edge of community gatherings, warnings told to children who wandered too far. But in this Alabama shack, the whispers weren't warnings. They were lived reality, and those who dared to step inside often left with a silence heavier than words could carry. They say the first collapse began when the family stopped leaving the land. Poverty was part of it, but not the whole of it. Distance from town grew into distrust, and distrust hardened into exile. Over time, even the act of marrying outside the family became unthinkable. Not for moral reasons, but because no outsiders ever came close enough. The shack stood alone at the edge of overgrown woods, where dirt roads turned to mud and wagons refused to travel. Visitors were rare, and those who came uninvited often returned unsettled, muttering about the faces they saw pressed against the windows, and so the cycle turned. Cousins became partners. Children were born with the kind of features that made townsfolk whisper about curses, but the truth was simpler and more horrifying. These weren't curses at all. They were the logical outcome of a family sealed inside its own walls. Each birth drew the blood tighter, and each death left the survivors more dependent on one another. Over time, deformities sharpened. Speech grew slower, movement more strained. Yet to each other, this was normal. This was life. Imagine a child in that house, growing up knowing only the faces of kin who shared the same twisted lines of the jaw, the same glassy stare. For them, it wasn't grotesque. It was family. It was comfort. The world outside their walls, with its well-dressed strangers and its scornful looks, was the real horror. And so they stayed hidden, safe in their silence, while the shack rotted around them. To outsiders, this story feels like something from the dark corners of folklore, but the truth is far colder. These people lived, they breathed, they laughed, they mourned, just as any family does. The only difference was that their blood had been trapped in a cycle too tight to escape. And because no one came to open the door, the shack itself became a vault of living memory, one that even now, decades later, refuses to release its secrets. As the decades crawled forward, the shack began to change, not from renovation, but from decay. Its walls sagged, its roof leaked, and the boards warped with every passing season. Yet the family within remained, clinging to routines that blurred the line between survival and surrender. Food was sparse, often scavenged or traded in secrecy. The clothes they wore were patched and torn, fabric so worn it seemed ready to dissolve. But what stood out most to those few who glimpsed them was not poverty. It was the eerie sameness in their appearance, as if time itself had stopped aging them in peculiar ways. Faces reflected each other like warped mirrors. Brothers who looked like sons, mothers whose features matched their daughters almost perfectly, except for the deepening lines of age. A genealogy that folded inward until individuality became difficult to separate. Their laughter carried through the thin boards of the shack, not in joy, but in tones that left outsiders uneasy. Strange cadences, stilted speech, echoes of a language that seemed to belong only to them. For the townsfolk, it was easier to pretend these people didn't exist, easier to write them off as the family up in the woods and let their shack dissolve into obscurity. But obscurity never truly erases. Instead, it buries, and when a story is buried, it festers. Neighbors remembered odd encounters, half-seen figures walking barefoot in the mud at night, a sudden knock on a door followed by silence, the unsettling moment when a child with crossed eyes stood in the field, staring too long at a passing car. These memories became part of the town's folklore, shared in hushed voices over coffee, always followed by a warning: never go near that shack. Inside, however, life was not a horror story to them. It was simply what they knew. They loved each other in ways outsiders could never understand because they had no one else to love. But love twisted by isolation becomes something fragile, something brittle. The bonds that held them together were also the chains that kept them trapped. They were both victims and participants in a cycle that seemed to stretch back endlessly. And in their silence, in their seclusion, the line between normalcy and nightmare vanished entirely. Every nail in that shack, every creak in its floorboards, carried the weight of lives lived unseen, and as the structure decayed, it became less a home and more a monument, a rotting shrine to what happens when a family's history folds in on itself until there is nowhere left to go. There comes a point in every buried story when silence begins to crack. For this family, that crack was not a rescue nor a salvation, it was exposure. By the 1970s, whispers had grown louder. Researchers, journalists, and the curious began to turn their gaze toward the shack hidden in Alabama's woods. The family, once ghosts, suddenly became specimens. Cameras intruded where silence once lived. Notes were taken on their faces, their speech, their movements, as if they were artifacts rather than human beings. And the family, confused and cornered, could do nothing but exist under the gaze of outsiders who came not to help, but to stare. Imagine the humiliation of being treated as both a warning and a curiosity. Children who had never left the woods were suddenly catalogued. Adults who had only known the comfort of kinship found themselves dissected with words like deformity and mutation. The outside world, which had abandoned them for decades, now returned not with compassion, but with judgment. And in those moments, the shack became something worse than a prison. It became a stage. But the stage did not bring applause. It brought shame. The family grew wary, shrinking back into shadows whenever strangers came near. Yet, The damage had been done. Their secret was no longer secret. What had once been whispers in town became headlines in dark corners of the media, stories told for shock, for profit, for entertainment. The family's humanity was stripped from them piece by piece, until all that remained in the public imagination was a grotesque symbol of inbreeding and isolation. And here lies the deepest cruelty of all. For while their blood carried the visible weight of generations turned inward, their suffering was not chosen. They had not asked to be born into such a cycle. They had not asked for the silence of neighbors who refused to intervene. They had not asked to become monsters in the stories others told. Yet that is exactly what happened. They became less than people, their shack less than a home. And in the eyes of the outside world, they were no longer a family at all. They were a legend of horror, their lives reduced to a cautionary tale. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed hidden or tried to escape into a world that saw you as something less than human? But legends are cruel things. Once a family becomes myth, the truth is seldom told. The Alabama shack began to feature in hushed stories passed between generations, always darker, always more exaggerated. Outsiders imagined grotesque scenes, painted the family as something subhuman, a living warning of what happens when blood forgets to branch outward. But what was lost in those retellings was the most important part, the quiet humanity that still lingered inside that rotting home. Because behind the distortions, there were still moments of tenderness. A child laughing when a sibling tripped in the mud, a mother brushing tangled hair from her daughter's face, a father sitting silent on the porch as the sun set, his hands rough and cracked from gathering wood. They were not monsters. They were a family, broken by circumstance, abandoned by community, and consumed by isolation. The deformities outsiders stared at were not curses. They were scars of neglect, physical reminders of what happens when people are left to suffer alone. Still, the horror remained. Not the kind invented for ghost stories, but the slow horror of watching a family tree collapse into itself. Every new child bore the weight of decisions made decades before their birth. Some carried visible marks in their faces and speech, others carried invisible burdens in their minds and bodies, and no matter what, the cycle seemed impossible to break. The world outside was too cruel to accept them, and the world inside the shack was too closed to let them leave. By the 1980s, the family had become a symbol of America's forgotten underbelly. Sociologists studied them, journalists hunted their story, and strangers drove miles just to glimpse the shack where the most inbred family lived. But with every telling, the story grew further from truth. The shack wasn't simply a home of deformities, it was a monument to silence. A reminder that entire families can vanish into the woods, not because they want to, but because the rest of the world lets them. And when you understand that, the horror shifts. You stop asking, how could they do this to themselves? And begin asking something far more uncomfortable. How could we, as a society, let them vanish until there was nowhere left to turn but inward? Even now, long after the shack has rotted into the soil, its memory refuses to die. Locals still speak of it in murmurs, as though saying the family's name aloud might invite their ghosts back into the light. The woods that once surrounded it have grown thicker, swallowing what little trace remains, but if you walk there at dusk, the silence feels heavier than anywhere else in Alabama, as though the land itself remembers what happened, and it does not forgive. Some say you can still hear the echoes, the faint shuffle of bare feet on rotting boards, the sound of uneven laughter carried by the wind. Others swear the ground feels wrong, as though it resists your step, warning you to turn back. Whether these are hauntings or just the weight of human memory doesn't matter, because in a way, that shack is still alive, not in wood or stone, but in the stories it left behind. And those stories hold a mirror. They remind us of the cost of silence, of how quickly a family can be erased when no one dares to reach out a hand. They remind us that neglect can deform more than faces. It can deform entire generations. This family didn't ask to be trapped, they didn't choose isolation, but the longer the world pretended not to see them, the deeper their blood turned inward, until their very existence became a warning. It is easy from a distance to call them grotesque, to treat their lives as a curiosity, a spectacle, or a horror story whispered in the dark. But when you strip away the deformities, the silence, the shame, you are left with something far more devastating. You are left with human beings who wanted what all families want: connection, survival, love, and yet they were given none of it by the world outside their door. Alabama's hidden shack may be gone, its wood scattered, its roof collapsed, but the weight of what it sheltered remains. It lingers not just as a chilling piece of hidden history, but as a question aimed squarely at us. When we encounter suffering that is easier to ignore, do we turn away, letting it fester into something unspeakable? Or do we face it, even when it horrifies us? Because in the end, the shack was not simply a relic of inbreeding. It was a mirror of our collective silence. And its story will remain, whether we look into that mirror or not. So now the shack stands only in memory, yet its shadow stretches long across American soil. It is not the boards or the nails that matter anymore, it is the story carved into them. A story of how a family, left to wither in isolation, became both victims of their own blood and of a society that chose not to see. Their faces may have been twisted, their voices strange, but the true deformity lies not in their flesh, but in our willingness to let them vanish. Think of it, a home so hidden that generations could live and die without ever being touched by the outside world. A cycle so tight that each child bore the echo of the last, until individuality itself seemed to blur. And all the while, the world beyond their woods looked the other way, content to let whispers replace action, content to turn human lives into rumor. The shack became a coffin built in plain sight, and we walked past it without opening the door. This is the haunting truth beneath Alabama's forgotten shack. It is not merely a tale of inbreeding, not just a grotesque curiosity for late-night conversations. It is a parable of neglect, a record of what happens when silence hardens into cruelty, when people become so invisible that their suffering transforms into spectacle. The family who lived there will never speak for themselves now. Their voices are buried beneath the rot. But their story survives, not because they wanted it told, but because the land itself refuses to forget. And so, we are left with the question no one wants to answer. How many other shacks still stand, hidden deep in the backwoods of America, their families sealed away in silence, their histories waiting to collapse inward? How many faces are never seen because we have trained ourselves not to look? The horror of the Alabama shack is not locked in the past. It is a reminder, pressing against the present, asking us if we are any less blind than the generations who ignored it. Some truths are not meant to comfort. They are meant to disturb, to make us see what we would rather leave hidden. And as long as the memory of that shack endures, so too does the weight of its question. When silence becomes cruelty, who will open the door?